Perhaps we'd have the reading now then. Zoe very kindly agreed to read for us. It's Hebrews 11, the roll call of Heroes of Faith. And it's verses 23 to 29. By faith, Moses, come to.
By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child. And they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God, and to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he has respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured, as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians are saying to do with drown.
Well, we've been looking at Hebrews chapter 11, and we talked last week about Abraham and the week before Abraham, and I mentioned how Abraham left a home of comfort to live the rest of his days in a tent, and he never knew really where he was going. All he knew is that God was leading him and showing him the way, and sometimes that happens for us. He doesn't show us the full picture, and he asks us to trust, and that basis of trust is a very important thing, something that's we struggle to get by sometimes. We want the whole story painted before us. Be thou my vision. Sometimes is one where we want to know everything, so we know the days ahead will go. But thankfully, the Lord doesn't work like that. He asks us to develop the relationship, the friendship, and the measure of trust. And so we'll have a little look at tonight Moses, and we're really going to go up from verse 23 to verse 26. We'll pick up some other points maybe next week, or we'll move on to the next one or two others in the group that's in the list that's behind Moses. But Abraham's parents, we are told, was worshippers of other gods. They were idolaters. But Moses' parents were believers. And so we have immediately this comparison, and that Abraham came from a home that knew nothing about God. And so we read concerning him, the God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham. And it was so blessed for him that his parents, though, were worshippers of other gods. But Moses' parents were believers. They believed in the Lord. When we come to Moses, we find that Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, as they were nearing death, their faith became so important to them. And the 3 instances of their testimony in Hebrews 11 are all part and parcel of it as they're closing their days. Joseph said towards the end of his days, you make sure you take my bones with you when you go out from this land. And we find that Isaac and Jacob, they were at the end of their days, but their faith was so prominent there. But with Moses, we find that his parents, that their faith was at the beginning of his life. Their faith, not Moses' faith now, their faith was at the beginning of Moses' life. Do you know, it doesn't matter whoever you are. You may come from a religious background, you may not. You may be someone that is coming to the end of your days. Or you may be someone that's about to begin a new adventure, a new life. It doesn't matter whenever, whoever, whatever. Faith can be your companion. Faith is a living reality that the Bible teaches. And so, whoever we are, whatever is the situation, and whenever it is, and in whatever stage of life it is, faith can become so relevant to us. And so we find with Moses that his life begins with his parents, and it would in that regard, I know, but by faith, Moses, when he was born, he was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a proper child and were not afraid of the king's commandment. When he was born, he was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a proper child. What does that mean? They saw that he was a beautiful child, is what the New King James, I think, puts it. A beautiful child. Someone, the meaning of the word really means a town person. Because if you lived in a town in those days, you would have been considered to have bigger advantages than living out in the country. We see a young baby today that's born on a farm and all the rest, and rosy red cheeks and all the different things. But if you were born in a city, then you were considered to be at an advantage. And so they saw that he was a beautiful child, a proper child. The New International Version talks about they understood him to be a special child. And so we have all these different ways of looking at it. But if we go back to the days of Abraham, Abraham had been told in Genesis 15 that for 400 years his people would suffer affliction in the land of Egypt, that they would persecute them. But at the end of that 400 years, then God would bring them out. He would deliver them. And so it is at this time that his parents were believing that they were close to that promise. They believed it. They didn't know if it was going to be theirs, but perhaps many a heart, many a home hoped that the deliverer would be born into their home. And so we find here with Moses that he was born for such a time as this. The same that was said of Esther when she was given the challenge that she would stand for her people and make herself known in the palace. Her uncle said to her, Mordecai, you are born for such a time as this. If you choose not to take up the challenge, then God will raise up someone else. And so we find here that his parents, they believed that it was this special time, and they were looking that this child of theirs might be the one, a proper child, a beautiful child. They were not afraid of the king's commandment. That word afraid, they were not prepared to flee the king's commandment. They refused to flee. They refused to flee from that command that had been given, that any children that would be born, particularly sons, they would be thrown into the river Nile. They were not afraid of the king's order. We're not going, they said. We're staying. And they hid the child away for 3 months. And then after 3 months, they did what they did with the child. And they saw a wonderful miracle that God did. And so by faith, his parents received Moses into the home, believing that he was someone special. And they were not prepared to go back on this adventure of faith. They believed that God would look after them and lead them forward. Verse 24 says, by faith, Moses, when he was of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. When he was of age, he refused. When he was born, his parents refused. You see, that same spirit of faith that was there in his parents were there in Moses as well. Perhaps even more so, because we find that he was going to be willing to put aside so much. But we find with Moses that he bore that same spirit that his parents had. The wonderful thing so very often we find in the Old Testament, we struggle sometimes when I told you about the hotel that we stayed in on our recent holiday, And there's obviously a fight going on in one sense. When I say a fight, I don't mean an argument in the sense of tensions and that. But it started as a Christian hotel. And now, as they've opened up to all the different booking things that you can do on the internet, you're finding that a lot of people are going that have no contact with Christian life at all. And so the Christian parts of the holiday that are so common, that have been there for 50 years, many of these people that are coming in don't want those things. They want a bar there. You see it on TripAdvisor. They want a bar there, and they want this there, and they want that there. Why should you have a thought for the day in the main concourse when we all got a pass, and so you make us go upstairs to the restaurant, to get to the restaurant and come back down the other side of the stairs? And so it's this struggle, isn't it? It's not like before. And we find so often by the second or third generation of a Christian that has had children or grandchildren, and there are people telling them, but you're not like your dad, are you? You're not like your mum, are you? And we find with Jacob that he had this wonderful experience, Jacob, when he looked back comparing himself to his father Isaac and to his grandfather Abraham. And he said this concerning himself: the blessings that are upon me are greater than the blessings that were upon my fathers. That's an unusual thing to say, isn't it? By the next generation after Joshua, the writer says in the book of Judges that they didn't believe the same things. They moved on to new ways of thinking. And so we have here with Moses that he bore that same spirit. We read it in the New Testament, where Paul, writing to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 1, he talks in these ways concerning Timothy. He said, I speak of the faith, the genuine faith, that was in your grandmother and in your mother, and I persuade it is in you also. Same spirit of faith, see. Doesn't have to lessen, doesn't have to weaken, it can increase. And here we have this brother. He's there, and by faith, when he comes of age, when he's 40 years of age, he makes the decision that was to be so life-changing. He made his decision in his prime, at 40 years of age. Stephen tells us in Acts chapter 7 that he was mighty at this point in both word and deed. He was an orator. That's quite clear in the book of Deuteronomy. He was an orator of extraordinary capabilities. He was mighty in word, but he was also mighty in deed. Jewish records suggest that he led a major campaign against Ethiopia and was the returning conquering prince of Ethiopia at around about this time. There were celebrations of his name, that he was a man that was mighty in both word and deed. And it's at this point that he makes the decision that is to be so life-changing. So we find concerning Moses that he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He's just like his mum and dad. He refused. There are times when we refuse and we dig our heels in. There are times when we refuse, and it's exactly what God really wants. The problem sometimes of when we say, I don't do that, the question has to be asked back, well, what do you do then? It has to be asked back. Because so many times in Christian circles, we look and we say, well, I don't do that. But you see, the sanctification that Christ brings to us is not just about doing things. It's about doing things. It's about being things. I remember John Wells taking a youth meeting in Penyrheol church one time, and he said, it's not enough to say that I don't go to the pictures, that I don't swear, that I don't go to the pub, that I don't hang on street corners. It's not enough to say that. What do you do then, he said? What do you do? If it's just no, 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 where is the yes, 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 yes? And there are times for refusing. And here Moses refuses to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He refuses it. But it also says there that he chose. He said, I'm not going to do that, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do that, but this is what I'm going to do. And so it says here, He's refusing and he's choosing. And he chose. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. We talk about Abraham leaving a home that was centrally heated. It had underground heating, underfloor heating at that time. The archaeologists have established that now from the days of Abraham there in Ur of the Chaldees. And he lived the rest of his days in a tent. To feel cool in the heat of the day, he sat in the door of the tent, where there would have been a breeze of some sort. He had no respite like that in a home. But here with Moses, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. And so with Moses we find, what did he do then? He counted the cost. That's what he did. He counted the cost. Jesus says that, don't we? Or doesn't he? When he's speaking of those people that are thinking of following him. And he turns to them and says, but you need to count the cost. When we used to have open doors in the 70s, that magazine that was there telling of the persecuted church, particularly in Eastern Europe. Not much was known about China then. It was a closed door. The bamboo curtain was stronger than the iron curtain, and there was very little news coming out. But in the 70s, there was a family there that many of you would have come across in reading those magazines. The Vins family, V-I-N-S. The one in particular, Georgi Vins. He was a pastor. His son became a pastor. His father was a pastor, and his grandfather was a pastor. But Brother Vins used to sit those new converts down, those that were interested in following after Christ, and he said to them, now look, we must count the cost. Do you understand what it means to be a Christian? Do you understand what it will cost you? That your career will not be the career now that you would have wanted, that you would have planned for, that you would have studied for, that you would have hoped for. Everything that your parents would have hoped for. Maybe you're not going to get that now. Because everything in the system was geared against that. And so Moses counted the cost. Brother Vins used to say to the new disciples, do you realize what it means to give your life to the Lord Jesus? He counted the cost. He refused and he chose. And he chose to leave the palace that he might be with the people of God. Not only was he choosing after he had been refusing, we find in verse 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ far greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. There was refusing, there was choosing, and there was now esteeming the reproach of Christ far greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. I wondered if you listened to that CD or song by Jim Reeves that used to sing, I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather have him than riches and gold. Because that's literally what he did. We were reading through 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and it emphasizes the point of giving. And I was listening to one particular brother speaking on this subject, and he mentions in his sermon, he said he read some sayings that were coming out from a China Inland Mission director, and he listed a number of things of what the world says and what Jesus says. The world says, how much did you give? And Jesus says, how did you give it? The world says, what amount did you give? Jesus says, how much did you keep? And when he said that, I thought, well, I've never thought of it like that before. We see concerning Moses, esteeming the reproach of Christ, far greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. He refused, he chose, and he esteemed. I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather have him than great riches and gold. In verse 26, it doesn't just say he was esteeming, it says that he was looking. He was looking as well. For he looked to the reward. Paul speaks about this, doesn't he, when he talks about his past and his future. He talks about what he did with his past, and he had to let it all go. In verse 12 of Philippians chapter 3, he says this, I press on that I may lay hold. Verse 13, he says, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead. Verse 14 says, I press toward the goal. It's a pushing forward. It's a looking forward. It's a looking up. And so we find him, I suppose, again, that song that was so popular in the 70s. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back. The cross before me, the world behind me. No turning back. No turning back. There was refusing, they were choosing, they were esteeming, and they were looking. For he looked to the reward. I've decided to follow Jesus. Do you know it's the first time we come across this type of phrase? He becomes a disciple of Jesus before Jesus was ever born. He decided his faith at this point in those early days was such, he understood that to follow Christ was going to bring him so many troubles, but he said it was worth it. Better that. I remember listening to Bobby Cox. Some of you remember Bobby. He's about so high, had about 3 teeth left in his head in his final days, when he was in 96 years of age. But I remember Bobby saying once, when he was preaching up in Berkeley, his biggest regret. Do you know what it was? His biggest regret was this, that when he had the flu, and he was taking a missionary campaign, or a mission campaign somewhere, and he was so bad with the flu, that his host said to him, you will have to take a paracetamol, Bobby. And he took one. And he said, I've never taken a tablet before, and I've never taken a tablet since. It's the biggest regret of my life. And Bobby feel. He was looking. Are you looking? As we come to the end now, Hebrews 13, verse 13. From chapter 10, verse 19 onwards is one complete exhortation. Right through to the end of Hebrews 13. There's very little theology in it. It's all exhorting, encouraging, getting the people to look forward, to look up. This is what it says there. Let us go forth to Jesus outside the camp. One translation puts it like this. Let's go forth to him outside the boundaries of respectability. Let's go forth to Jesus outside the camp, bearing his reproach. Here we have no continuing city, but we seek one to come. Moses, he went outside the camp of respectability, bearing the reproach of Christ. Could you imagine what people, the pleadings of his stepmother there in the palace, the pleadings of friends, the pleadings, all the different things that would have gone on, and found him wrestling with it all. This world is not my own, or not my home. I'm just a passing through. Are we so fixed on this earth that we care not for Christ? Are we so fixed? So, well, with Moses, he refused. Wonderful. But with it, he chose even better. Even more, esteeming the pride he had within his heart that he belonged to Jesus. He chose him above all others. Finally, he looked to the reward. There were difficult days ahead, but he knew at the end he would be the better for it. I said to Judith today about one particular difficulty that we've had over recent weeks and months. And I said, the thing is, Jude, if we don't let it go, it's going to affect us. We'll be the better off for doing the Christian thing. We'll be the better off to doing what Christ would want us to do. She agreed straight away. You know it. It's putting it into practice, it is, isn't it? Putting it into practice. When you know it's the very right thing to do, and yet you hold back from it, and you're the worse for it by holding back. All the fears that comes with it. Well, Moses was a man of faith, and he came from a house of faith. Some of you have Christian homes. When we look at Philemon there in Babylon, we find that there's a Christian home in the house of Philemon. Philemon, our sister Apphia, and the son Archippus. Paul's words to the jailer, wasn't it? Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you shall be saved, and your house. And we find with Cornelius that his house was saved. We find with Lydia that her house was saved. And so we find with Moses that he belonged to mum and dad who were believers, and he too became believers. May we say, Jesus is the head of this house. The unseen guest. And I can't remember the rest of it. I remember those things on the little plaques that you'd see in houses. Is he the head of our house? Is he in the heart of our lives? Are we refusing? Are we choosing? Are we esteeming? Are we looking? For a day is soon to come where Moses too will be nearing the end of his day, and faith will be there for him. Marvelous faith that will follow him through. May you and may I be a people of faith. In Jesus' name. Well, thanks for your time.